I hope I'm audible to all of you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, as mentioned, this particular module focuses mostly on globalizing context, right? And especially with our IPE, um, one of the it is one thing to describe the structure of world politics in the modern period as revolving around the state system, but it is also completely a different way to imagine that it can be beyond the state system as well. So the sovereign state is definitely there; it's around us, and but um, we hear a lot that it's under challenge, and new systems are emerging, and signs of it have been very evident from our last discussions as well with this neoliberal challenges. They embody a critique of state centrism, um, not just at a descriptive level, but also normatively, because many of the assumptions about what we thought was the state, what we thought is good life, was getting challenged. For one of the examples is something that we live with in the present time called good governance. Good governance is very different from good state or good life as is described by theorists of welfare. The good governance is mostly about something else that we will come to very soon. So the idea of globalization comes under this context when sovereign state is supposedly withering away and a new kind of a structure is supposedly coming in, and that perspective holds that what we call globalization is transforming the state. This is something which we have to sit back and see whether they are transforming the state or whether they are inaugurating something completely different. So, what is the concept of globalization in a general sense? Um, Definition wise, there are these ideas of globalization which were very popular. I mean, for example, people talk about the Webster definition of globalization, the dictionary definition of globalization almost starts in 1960s, which doesn't mean that globalization only started in 1960s, but it got realized that it is something to be explained in the 1960s. And as you would know, 1960s is also that kind of a time when economy was on the boom, right? In the last discussions we said that it's only in the 70s that there were some confusions. So beginnings of uh, explicit recognition in the contemporary world of a new world order were taking shape. Connections were building up in a different way. Many more studies about this phenomenon was also coming up, about how different it is to define a global context, and increasing connectivity and the volume of exchange of commodities were also coming up, and finally also an emergence of global consciousness. Some people call it cosmopolitanism. Are you familiar with this word cosmopolitan? uh, Cosmos is uh, universe in a certain kind of way. Cosmopolitan is a denizen or a person who lives in the universe. It's a broad kind of a perspective. So globalization is not just about commodities, exchange, people, ideas, but it's also about a kind of a social reorganization, a process whereby people are increasingly bounded into what some people imagine is a new society, a bigger society. So as a historical force, globalization propels the world as we know towards a different kind of future uh, from what it was before. But culturally also, the idea is producing what some people call a homogenization. Hmm? ഏകമാത്രയിലേക്ക് കൊണ്ടുവരിക. Homogenization of the idea of modernity. Modernity gets homogenized, um, and that gets based on certain core areas, like in the West, that gets homogenized. what some people call it McDonaldization, and all. McDonald is the food chain, fast food chain, which has a symbol which is a big golden arch of M. M in the shape of the arch. Burger joints at McDonald's. It's an American joint. And this kind of symbols are getting recognized across the world, which is like a kind of a homogenization of culture. Politically, that's culture, but politically, globalization gets understood as referring not only to this interconnection between people within networks of global governance, but the spread of shared political values across the world. That is about political globalization. The homogenizing forces of globalization on a geographical scale mean that boundaries are breaking down, distances are shrinking, places are losing its significance. Every place is like any other place. Economically, which is a direct issue for us IP scholars, globalization becomes to be seen as it comes basically after the collapse of communist states towards the 90s, and the ascendancy of what we've been talking about in the last 3-4 lectures about neoliberal ideas. So in that kind of a sense, globalization represents capitalism's victory, right? And globalization also represents a kind of a unified economic system, which is basically capitalist in nature, based on capital's movement, capitalism. Given that capitalism also embodies, capitalism is not just about economics, right? It has lots of social things in it. So it embodies new social ways, new cultural ways, new values. But the economic dimension cannot be seen as separate from all these kinds of socio-cultural or political value systems. So now globalization has been, or we have to conceive as a process in which the institutions that we used to call quote unquote national authorities, that we used to refer to, actors that we used to see, and so on, all of them are somehow getting bypassed in the course of interactions around the world, especially in economic sphere. Many of these structures are getting bypassed. So widely you say that there is an assertion that we live in an era in which social life is determined by global processes, in which cultures, economies, national borders or boundaries are dissolving. And the perception is that a rapid and recent process of economic globalization, or truly global economy, there is a global economy, we are told, that claims to have emerged or is in the emergence in the current world. And certainly the notion that, entities like transnational corporations, which owe no allegiance to any nation state and can readily rise above national economies, is reflected in practice by the fact that many of these corporations, they don't pay tax, for example, right? They pay only little tax. They don't pay much responsible. They don't pay much responsible attention to fair share of tax payments. And this was a lot in the media in the middle of 2013 to 2016. In the OECD countries, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, because individually and OECD and G20, they had a move to extract the fair amount of tax from these transnational corporations, because world economy has internationalized to such a degree that these transnational corporations who don't have any kind of allegiance to social contract, the social contract that we studied in our theory and thought portions, they don't have the social contract. So these OECD and G20 countries in 2013 and 16, uh, tried to bring in a system whereby you have to tax these big corporations like Microsoft, um, or Citibank, your OTT platform called Netflix, all of these. And OECD estimated that the governments had been missing out on tax revenue between 100 billion US dollar to around 240 billion each year because of tax evasion. We have similar signs in the national or the Indian national context as well, right? Big corporations who don't have any social responsibility in terms of the tax they pay. But on the other hand, farmers are paying their debt, and if they can't pay their debt, they commit suicide. But these are also effects of a global economic process on the rise. On a related theme, although there are differences between Adam Smith and Karl Marx, they share a conviction that capitalism was global in character. During Adam Smith and Marx as well, the global character of capital was well understood. Even though in 1960s, this globalization as a word gets a meaning in dictionaries, the idea of the global movement of capital was well there. And for Adam Smith, you hear about what you call that? What kind of a hand is that? Invisible hand, right? Invisible hand of market. And Marx understood the spread of capitalism as a necessity. So Marx is also a theorist who talks about the withering away of the state. So basically, it's a kind of a call or a kind of a projection that what will happen when capital kind of a degree, but also he also talks about the rise of the proletariats. So this was to be realized with the defeat of capitalism and triumph of communism as a total political or social system. In the contemporary period, though, it is a triumph not of this laborers, not of the proletarians, but it's a triumph of global capitalism and not communism that has been seen the state variously withering away. The withering away of the state, as Marx thought, was about what? State getting withered away because they are getting challenged by people who are on the receiving end. But this is not the withering away of the state as Marx talked about that we are seeing, but the withering away of the state because of the movement of capital. മൂലധനത്തിന്റെ പ്രത്യേക തരത്തിലുള്ള ചലനങ്ങൾ മൂലം സ്റ്റേറ്റുകൾ പല രീതിയിലും ഇല്ലാതെ ആവുന്നു. That kind of a tendency. So what we understand is that the idea of the global has been there theoretically or even economically from Smith and Marx. Whether Smith's invisible hand or Marx's withering away of the state, we see that kind of a tendency of a globalization of capital, but they imagined it in a different way. And it has moved historically through different kinds of stages. So in that sense, we can put globalization in a historical perspective, right? So how can we do that? The kind of interconnections that are seen in global processes have been there for a long time. The idea of cosmopolis, for example, it's a Stoic notion, old notion, and the fact that major traditions of religions also had globalization in their view. So I'm just going a bit into some kind of history. Okay, from Christianity or Islam law. Christianity and Islam has an idea of a community of humankind, right? Christendom or Islam and the Ummah, right? So these kinds of community, which is global in nature, is there. And they seem remote from the present day discussions of globalization, of course, but they embody the idea of transcending political community, establishing interconnections. So globalization is